backgrounds. If you do have questions during the presentation, we do encourage you to use the chat box that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen during Professor Mueller's remarks. Hopefully, time permitting, all will be answered by the end of the program. For easier viewing, you might want to go up to the right-hand portion of your Zoom screen, and you have a choice between gallery view and speaker view. And so it might be less distracting for you if you chose speaker view, and you might be able to see and enjoy the program. We are so happy tonight to welcome Professor Jon Mueller to help us understand how our behavior affects others and what we can do to be aware and affect change in ourselves. Jon Mueller is a professor of psychology at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois. As a social psychologist, he's taught courses in stereotyping and prejudice. Additionally, he created and maintains a large annotated collection of resources for the teaching of social psychology to assist teachers and professors throughout the country in preparing their courses. I hope you all will join in and welcome Professor Mueller. Professor Mueller, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction and for the invitation for me to come this evening. I wish we could all be together in person, but I'm glad you could come this evening and participate. As Barb said, after my presentation, there'll be time for questions and answers, and I may stop once or twice during the presentation to take a question or two. So as she said, go ahead and use the chat to leave comments or questions along the way. I'm going to begin by talking about sources of racism, sources of prejudice and discrimination, where that comes from, and then talk about how do we maintain those, hold on to those prejudices we have and biases that we have, despite the fact that we encounter contradictory information all the time. And then after I've depressed you with that for a while, I'll finish up and talk about how the psychological research does suggest some ways that we can reduce prejudice and discrimination and racism. As you can imagine, it's not easy, but it's possible, and I'll talk a little bit about that research as well. But first, I'm going to pretend like we are all together, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Not yet. Just raise your hand if your cell phone is an iPhone. All right, you can put your hands down now. And now raise your hand if your phone is an Android phone. What I would do next, if we were all together, and what I do with my students, is I would then divide you up into two groups, the iPhone group and the Android group. And I would have you have a discussion and keep a list of the reasons you thought the other group had that type of phone. Android people would come up with reasons why iPhone people had an iPhone, and iPhone people would come up with reasons why they had an Android. The other group had the Android. And what we would likely find, and we found many times, is that you would start out initially listing some mundane reasons why they might. But gradually, eventually, you would start developing more and more negative reasons for why people are in that other group. They don't have enough money to own an iPhone, or they're not smart enough to operate an Android, or their fingers are too pudgy to hit the buttons on phone X, or whatever it might be. We found this again and again and again. We developed something called the minimal group paradigm, in which we simply bring participants in the lab and then randomly divide them up into one of two groups. It can be as simple as flipping a coin and put you in the head group or the tail group. And surprisingly, the head group starts thinking that their group is better, even though they've been randomly divided on this. We ask people, do you think a hot dog is a sandwich? That gets some heated discussion, but you're in one group or the other, and you start thinking that your group is the better group. There was a study quite a few years ago where they had people come to this room and they handed them a piece of litmus paper that turned either pink or green. And then they told them, take your paper and go into the large gymnasium next door, and then we'll tell you what we're going to do next. Well, the real study is what happened in the gymnasium. The people with the pink pieces of paper started hanging out together, and the people with the green pieces started hanging out together. And they were wondering why there's pink and green, and so they started generating explanations. And it wasn't long before they decided, the green people decided the pink people had pink for negative reasons, and the pink people thought the green, came up with negative explanations for why they had the green as well. It's an inevitable thing that happens when we start putting people into groups. Any trivial distinction can lead to this effect. There's a line that was created between Illinois and Wisconsin. So now those of us in Illinois have certain names for people in Wisconsin and think certain things about Wisconsinites. And people in Wisconsin think things about people in Illinois. They're wrong, but they think things about people in Illinois. And so it's very easy to start dividing yourself up into groups and start thinking things about these other groups. I'm going to share a document with you and take you through this a little bit more. Again, I've got the wrong document. Bear with me as well. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Is that showing up, Barb? Yes, good. All right. So that's me. And it's inevitable because our brain is wired to categorize, as you can imagine. Our ancestors decided, is this a threat or not a threat? Are red berries good berries to eat or poisonous berries? And so we quickly categorize things. We store information in memory in categories and subcategories and schemas that we form. So it's natural for us to categorize the world, including groups of people. But what happens is we tend to want to view ourselves in a positive light. And so we start to view the groups that we belong to in a positive light, and out-groups other groups in a more negative light. We call this the in-group bias. This tendency to prefer our own group over the out-group, and to perceive our own group as superior to the other group. And like with the examples I just gave, we do it quickly and easily. And that's important to us because we've also found that much of a person's identity is tied into the groups to whom they belong. If you ask somebody who they are, they'll sometimes tell you characteristics of themselves, like I'm humorous or I'm this, but often they define themselves in terms of the groups they belong to. I'm Christian, I'm live in California, I'm a woman, I'm a Cubs fan. Whatever it is, those groups we belong to play a large role in how we define ourselves. And so it's inevitable that we're going to form stereotypes. The word stereotype is actually a neutral term. We often think of it negatively, that we hold stereotypes about groups. But stereotypes can be positive or negative. They're just a set of beliefs that I have about a group and its members. So let's take a group. Let's take old people like me. Take a second and think, can you think of one or two positive attributes you associate with older people? Yes, that's right. We're wise, of course. We're cuddly. I don't know if that's one. We're compassionate, patient. These things don't apply to all people. We often overgeneralize these stereotypes. But there are positive attributes that we assign to groups. But most of the time we think of stereotypes negatively because most of the attributes that we assign to groups other than our own tend to be more negative attributes. We want to view ourselves positively, and so we want to view our groups positively. And one of the most common ways that we judge whether I'm good or not is in comparison to other people. So I also judge whether my group is good by comparing it to others. So if I put down your group and view it in a more negative light, that's going to make my group and myself look more positively in that case. So yes, stereotypes are inevitable also. We're going to form these beliefs about groups of people. But so far, not so bad. Yes, I've got some thoughts in my head about you and your group, but I haven't called the police on you yet. I haven't killed anybody in your group yet. I just have these thoughts going around in my head. But how do we get from there, these negative beliefs I have about your group, to prejudice and discrimination and racism? One of the most powerful ways we do that is through negative emotion. If I have negative beliefs about your group, and I also feel negatively about you in some emotional way, if I attach anger or frustration or fear to your group, that changes things dramatically. And so now these stereotypes lead to prejudice. We define as a preconceived negative attitude towards a group and its members. So stereotypes are a set of beliefs, whereas a prejudice is how I feel about your group. And prejudices, whereas stereotypes can be positive or negative, prejudices are always defined as a negative attitude that I have towards your group and its members. And that can lead to discrimination, which is unjustified negative behavior toward a group and its members. So the prejudice is the attitude, discrimination is the behavior that follows from that. There are a lot of different definitions of racism out there, and they often differ by discipline as well. Political scientists, for example, define racism different than psychologists do. But I'm going to give you the psychology version of that. And so commonly we define racism as combining those first two things. You're exhibiting racism if you exhibit prejudice and discrimination towards a racial or ethnic group and its members. That's somewhat narrow, though, in a sense that this prejudice and discrimination only applies towards racial or ethnic groups. We use the broader term bigotry to apply to any kind of prejudice toward and discrimination towards any group. So based on sexual orientation, I can be prejudiced or discriminate. That's bigotry. Towards people with disabilities, towards White Sox fans, I can have bigotry towards any kind of group. And so now I have this much stronger reaction to your group, a much more negative response. How does that come about? Where does this negative emotion come from? There are a lot of different sources, but one of the primary ones is a sense of threat. If I perceive that your group is a threat to mine, that's going to create, as I mentioned, a sense of fear or a sense of frustration or anger towards you and your group. One of the central things, though, we've learned in psychology is that it's not reality itself, but our perception of reality that influences our behavior. I'll repeat that. It's not reality itself, but our perception of reality that influences our behavior. So that means it doesn't matter whether your group is really a threat to my group or to me. All that matters is if I think you're a threat, if I perceive your group to be a threat, then this negative emotion will be attached to these beliefs that I have about your group. There are a lot of sources of threat, but two of the most powerful ones I'll talk about here briefly, and that is what we call realistic threat and symbolic threat. Realistic threat refers to a threat to our financial well-being or our personal safety. So if I think you can harm me in some way, physically or harm me financially, are you a threat to my job? Am I afraid of being injured or harmed by you? Are you going to give me disease? All kinds of ways we can feel either threats to our physical safety or threats to our financial well-being. You can think of, I imagine, lots of examples of that as well. As powerful as that is, that's quite a threat to my personal safety and my financial well-being. What sometimes is even more powerful a threat to us is what we call symbolic threat. That's where our values and beliefs are threatened. If someone or some group I perceive to be a threat to particularly my core values and beliefs, that's really perceived as a significant threat and drives me into action, drives me into anger, drives me into fear, but drives me into action. Let me give you an example of that by posing a little quiz to you. Recently, a survey was done of Americans to ask them which groups in America do you most dislike? And two groups tied for the top spot. That is, two groups were seen as most disliked by Americans. So stop and think, who do you think those two groups might be? Most disliked by Americans.
Perhaps people could type it in the chat, the two groups that they think are the most disliked in America. We have the far right, African Americans, KKK, African Americans and Muslims, the wealthy, the poor.
Yeah, those are all good guesses, and one of those is one of the two, and that was Muslims. Lots of people fear them both as a realistic threat, but also as a symbolic threat. Particularly if religious beliefs are a core component of your values. For Christians, for example, Jews and Muslims can be seen as a significant symbolic threat. Again, all that matters is whether I perceive them as a threat. Some Christians do, some Christians don't, but a lot of Americans perceive Muslims as a threat of some type or another. But the other group, probably none of you came up with, and may be surprising to a lot of people, but really illustrates the symbolic threat, and that is atheist.
Wow.
People really don't like atheists, particularly religious people. In fact, although now we have one or more Muslims as a member of Congress, we now have LGBT individuals, a member of Congress. I don't think there is yet a single atheist, declared atheist, as a member of Congress. I think there were one or two after they left, revealed that they were atheists. But that is a symbolic threat to a lot of people, particularly if religion is core to who you are and core to your beliefs, and you've built a foundation of your life around that. And then someone comes along and says it's all a myth, it's all bogus, it's not true. People find that as incredibly threatening.
Surprising.
The protests that we're seeing now are arising in part because, for some people at least, justice is a core value. And they're reacting against, rebelling against injustices that they see. And that creates a lot of anger and frustration in those individuals who hold justice as a core value. You can think back over history, how many wars were created, how many people died, not simply from realistic threat, but from symbolic threat as well. And so threat, particularly this realistic and symbolic threat, can lead to hatred and discrimination and ostracizing of people and groups, assigning stigmas to them, and even violence in these cases. So now we've moved to another level where I really don't like that group. They represent a significant threat to me and to my group in this case. But if you think about it for a minute, obviously we've all observed and heard about and seen people who display this level of emotion towards other groups and dislike towards them. We see hatred and discrimination, ostracism, stigma, violence. And yet for most people, they were raised to think of those things as bad things. Whether through their religion, through their family, through society, we were taught we're not supposed to hate or discriminate or aggress against other people. So how can I defend this action, these prejudices, this discrimination, if I want to hold on to them? Somehow we have to find a way to justify our prejudice and discrimination. That's what slave owners did many years ago. And often what they turn to is saying it's okay to treat these people in this way because they're not like us. They're savages, they're beasts, they're animals, they're subhuman. And in fact, we're doing them a favor, we're giving them work, we're providing them with Christianity, we're doing all kinds of things to help them. And they need our help because they're inferior to us. And that's one of the most common ways that we justify this prejudice. We turn this other group into the other. They're not like us. They're inferior. They're not even human. Think about that for a minute. And I'm going to ask Barb here a question. The one on the screen there. I'm going to ask her, what % human would you say you are?
Feel free to all help me in the chat.
But I'm asking about Barb now. And I'm asking Barb how human Barb thinks she is.
Well, maybe I don't want to know how human they think I am.
Yeah.
I'm going to cheat and say 100%.
100%. That seems like a reasonable thing since you're a human. Now let me ask you how human you think, what % human you think Judy is?
Oh, 110%.
110%. What about people who live in California? How human are they?
They're starting to get different. So I'm going to go 80%.
80%. So there's 20% of that person who lives in California who's not really human. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they're different. I guess
Oh, okay. Well, humans are different. I'm not saying we're all alike, but are they human?
Yes, they're human. 100%.
Are they 100% human, like you?
Yeah.
Okay. What about Canadians? What % human are they?
I guess I'm defining human as someone who is...
Are they a human being?
Yes, they're a human being, 100%.
What about criminals? What % human are they?
They're the same, just taking a different path. They're 100%.
Okay. That seems like a reasonable answer since I'm asking what percent human are people. Well, by definition, you would think they were 100%.
Right.
But that's not how a lot of people think of other groups of people. We tend to demonize other groups and associate the worst characteristics with them so we can think of them as less than human. You've heard a lot in the news lately about this QAnon conspiracy theory that's out there. It's got lots of complicated parts, but essentially it's a belief that there's this secret global group made up of Satan-worshiping, murderous pedophiles, mostly Democrats, part of the conspiracy goes, who are out to undermine President Trump. And so they attach the most negative attributes to these individuals. They're pedophiles, they're Satan worshipers, there's evils, they're murderers. And that allows us to see them and treat them and think of them as not like us and less human. And so we engage in this process of dehumanization, the process of depriving a person or group of positive human qualities. There was a clever series of studies that were done recently that used this scale that you've probably seen before, the ascent of humans from chimpanzee to humans, although I imagine chimpanzees say it goes the other way, but they asked participants in these studies, they gave them a sliding scale from 0 to 100%. And then they gave them the name of a group of people and they asked them, like I just asked Barb, what percent human do you think this group is? And these were always groups of people.
Like at least good food around here. There's no good food around here.
So they should say 100% because they're all humans, even though they're different. But here's what they found in these studies. I hope you can read this. I'm going to start at the bottom of the chart. They asked this group, Israelis, how human Palestinians are. And on average, they just said 44% human. Hungarians were asked about Roma, which are often groups of gypsies. Only 49%, less than half human. And you can see other groups that people often dehumanize, Muslims, Jews, blacks, ISIS members. The top studies are what Americans said about Mexican immigrants, about Muslims. More positive, more human for groups more like them, Australians, Japanese, and Europeans. Although they didn't all make 100% as well. And so we find it's possible to justify many of these negative beliefs and attitudes we have towards others and behavior towards them by treating them as less than human. I can treat you inhumanely if you're not human. I put a link here, as Barb said, she'll send you this page, the link to the full study. It's a very readable article, and so you can read more about this if you like. But let me ask you again, stop for a second and ask you to think, what are some other examples of groups that some groups tend to dehumanize? I'll give you one first and you can think of other. I mentioned criminals before. Prisoners are a group that many dehumanize. A recent study found that the top 10 hotspots for COVID in the United States are in prisons and jails. And in fact, in California, where they're having all the wildfires now, they're having trouble dealing with them in part because they often use prisoners to help fight fires, but many of them can't help now because they have COVID. But we don't hear a lot about that because, hey, they're prisoners. They get what they deserve. We don't treat them as human as we do other groups of people.
In the chat, we're getting comments of immigrants, disabled, mentally ill.
Absolutely.
Obesity.
Definitely. Those are ones I got on my list as well.
Trans people.
Yes. It's interesting when you look at LGBT LGBTQ people that, as we'll talk later about how we can reduce prejudice and discrimination, prejudice and discrimination has been reduced significantly in this country towards lesbians and gays. Again, there's still quite a bit of prejudice and hatred, but much more positive attitudes have developed. But it's still out there for groups that are more fluid in their orientation. So transgender, bisexual, people who are non-binary, people still can't get a handle on that. If you have one orientation, okay, you're gay or you're lesbian, it's not my favorite orientation, but at least you've got one thing. But if you're more fluid, people still have difficulty with that. So there are lots of groups that we stigmatize and dehumanize, as you said, in that way. I'm going to skip over questions at this point and just continue a little bit more, and maybe I'll catch you back in a little bit. All right, so now I've got my prejudices formed. I found ways to justify them. But as I suggested before, when I walk out that door and interact with people, and when I watch the media, I'm going to encounter lots of non-stereotypical behavior and information. Things that contradict my beliefs, contradict my stereotypes. But we don't like cognitive dissonance, a term probably many of you have heard, this uncomfortable tension we feel from when there's a conflict between our beliefs and our attitudes and our behaviors. So we don't like to give up our stereotypes and prejudices. We want to hold on to them. So how do we do that? What does psychology say about how do we maintain and perpetuate these prejudices? To answer that, I turn back to the human brain. And we have lots of tools. These tools aren't designed to maintain prejudice and stereotypes, but they serve that function. They serve that purpose as well as others. And probably the most powerful and prevalent tool of all is confirmation bias, which probably many of you have heard of. In fact, it's so prevalent that I tell my students in my social psychology class where we talk about it, that if any time during the semester I ask them a question and they're not quite sure how to answer, just say confirmation bias. It's probably related somehow. And as I'll talk about with these other tools, it's also something that's so common and so natural for us. Most of the time, we're not even aware that we're doing it. That we're seeking out information that agrees with our beliefs and ignoring information that disconfirms or disagrees with it. But it's a great tool to hold on to our beliefs, even incorrect ones. So I imagine I'm driving down the highway and somebody cuts me off and I don't like it. And I look at the driver and say, oh, yep, see, it's a woman. Women drivers, we know about them. Not really, I'm just using it as an example. And so my stereotype has been confirmed. But let's imagine now I'm driving along and I get cut off and I notice it's a male driver. What my brain does not do here is say, a male driver driving poorly. I might have to go back and change my stereotype about women drivers. No, my brain now ignores the gender of the person and picks out something else about the person that fits a stereotype I have. It's an old guy. Of course, I'm one of the old guys now. And he's got a little hat on, his blinker's been going for 2 miles, whatever. But now let's say the person who cuts me off is a male of my age. My brain automatically, without me even thinking about it, finds something else that confirms a different stereotype. It ignores gender, it ignores age, and instead says, it's a Lithuanian. They're the worst drivers. Nothing, just making that up. Or it's a Toyota driver. Oh, I hate Toyota drivers. Get them off the road. Our brain does that all the time, and often without us being aware of it. And so when I see something that confirms my belief, I think I'm being unbiased. I say, see, there's evidence. but I'm not aware of all the contradictory evidence that I've ignored and the fact that I'm just constantly looking for evidence that agrees with me. That's the only tool the brain needs to maintain stereotypes and prejudice. It maintains all kinds of hypotheses we have about the world, that confirmation bias. But we have others as well. You've heard this phrase a lot recently, implicit biases that we have. Implicit is just another word we use for unconscious or automatic. We used to think that most of our decision making, our choices, were done with our conscious mind, that we'd stop and think things and then that would lead to a decision, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But we've come to realize that's a completely inaccurate view of how the brain works. The vast majority of our information processing and even our decision making is done by our unconscious mind. And we're not even aware of it. Which sounds like a dangerous and perhaps problematic thing, and it can be at times. But it's actually a very, very useful thing that our unconscious mind, which has a lot more capacity than our conscious mind, is making most of our decisions. Think for a moment what walking would be like if it was controlled by your limited conscious mind. You would have to say, if you wanted to walk, okay, I now have to lift up my left leg. Okay, now I've got to bend it in this way and move it forward. I've got to turn my hip. I wouldn't get anywhere. And I wouldn't be able to do anything else all day if I had to consciously think about walking. But I don't. I've learned how to walk. I've turned it over to my unconscious mind. It takes care of it. My favorite example is something dangerous I do every day, but my unconscious mind is in control of it. And that's driving. I don't do as much of it now, but I used to drive to work every day, and about 3 or 4 miles in, I'd realize, oh, I'm driving. I'm supposed to be driving here. But obviously, my unconscious mind must have gone around all the curves and stopped at the stoplights because I'm still alive and on the road. But that allows my conscious mind to think of more important things, like what am I going to have for lunch today or something like that. So the conscious mind is absolutely necessary, invaluable. But it also does allow bias to exist without us necessarily being aware of it. And we can see the effect of that in something we call priming. This has got a lot of attention in the news the last few years. You may be familiar with this, but priming in general is just simply when something in the environment that we encounter activates thoughts in our mind, associations we have in memory. So we talk about E to P to B. Something in the environment, a stimulus in the environment, it might be a person I see of a certain race. Just seeing them activates thoughts about that race, brings up stereotypes I have about that group. And that in turn can affect my behavior. And this whole process from environmental stimulus to perceptions or stereotypes to behavior can happen completely outside of my conscious awareness. So I'm walking down the street and there's a black person. And that activates in my mind, without me being aware of it, stereotypes. And maybe my stereotype associates black with dangerous or hostile. And so without even thinking about it, I reach around and check my wallet. I just touch my wallet. And I don't even know I've done that. Or if I'm out in a car, I unconsciously check to make sure the door is locked. We do that easily and often and without even being aware of it at times. We have these stereotypes and we want to maintain them. There are lots of tools we use for this, but the last one I'm going to mention is what's called the Vividness effect. Let me ask you a question here to think about. How many words, are there more words in the English language that start with the letter R or have R as the third letter? Are there more words in the English letter that start with the letter R or have R as the third letter? Most people to that question would say words that start with R, because those words come to mind more easily. They're more vivid. I can think of rabbit and raccoon and refrigerator. But there's actually 3 times as many words in the English language that have R as the third letter. Card, or I'm going to have a hard time thinking of it now, barometer or whatever. But our brain, again, likes shortcuts. And this is a shortcut to help it make quick decisions. It grabs the first things that come to mind. And that's often the most vivid pieces of information in memory. Those stick with us. So if I see mugshots on TV, they're telling a story about somebody who's been arrested. And I see someone who's a person of color, that's going to be vivid. That's going to stand out to me. And I'm going to recognize it. And so I more easily now associate that person's group with criminality. Whereas if it's a white person or if it's a Lithuanian, I'll pick on them again, I don't immediately recognize that person as a Lithuanian, and so I don't associate them with criminality. But groups that I can pick out that are vivid, I'm much more likely and much more quickly can form stereotypes about them, and usually negative stereotypes about those groups, because I can more easily associate a behavior with that group. I can pick them out more easily. Think of it in this way. Do you know what DWB stands for? It can stand for a lot of things, but in the context of racism, what does DWB stand for? You may have heard of that one. It stands for driving while black. Lots of African Americans, many, 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 will tell you they've been stopped multiple times by police with no justification. But that police officer has an implicit bias and is then more naturally suspicious of that individual or suspects something, and so pulls them over. You're in the wrong neighborhood. Why are you here? What are you doing? And that's easy for that police officer to do who has that implicit bias, because they can quickly recognize that that driver is black. Blackness is much more vivid than other characteristics. What about the next one? Have you ever heard of SIASMYOBWB? Probably not. I just wrote that one out. That stands for sitting in a Starbucks, minding my own business while black. You may have heard that story not too long ago. And so they're shopping while black and walking while black because they're a particularly vivid group. It's much easier to pick out that group and then associate behavior with it. And usually we're going to associate negative things with that group. One last one, DWG. You probably haven't heard of that one because I made that one up. That's driving while German. So imagine there is a police officer who has an implicit bias against Germans. They're just much less likely to pull a German over because they can't identify that person easily as a German. They can identify easily that person as black or Latinx or Asian even. But German or Lithuanian, it's just so much harder. So that implicit bias isn't going to lead to pulling that person over. And if you're a black person, you get pulled over for no reason, or you think there's no justification, it's not surprising that you might be frustrated and respond with some frustration. And that police officer who has that implicit bias about your group that includes that they think that you're hostile says, see, I was right. They're being belligerent. They're being argumentative. And so it just confirms for them again that their stereotype is accurate. But it's just much easier to find that in groups and to form that in groups that stand out more easily. So some of the ones you mentioned before, Muslims, people with disabilities, there's lots of groups that are more visible than others. And so unfortunately, it's just much easier to form those stereotypes and to hold on to them. And then remember cases. So I maintain and perpetuate that stereotype because I can very vividly recall examples of, don't tell me that group isn't like this. What about this example? What about that example? I can recall all kinds of vivid examples quite easily. Just because we're running along here, I'm going to save the questions for the end, and I'm going to finish by talking about what might be some ways we could reduce prejudice and discrimination. And we can talk about all these things more afterwards and hear some of your questions. I'm first going to talk just briefly about what doesn't seem to work. What does the research say does not work? I talked about implicit bias, and you've probably also heard about implicit bias training. Lots of companies, organizations, law enforcement agencies, schools have implemented implicit bias training to try to reduce some of the prejudice and discrimination that they experience. Unfortunately, so far, the research has found that most of that training has been ineffective. Not all of it, but the vast majority of it has not been very effective. There's two reasons in particular the research has found. One is if it's made mandatory as opposed to voluntary. If you're forcing people to try to change their biases, often they react negatively to that. And there's even some backlash where it strengthens their biases, they find in some of these studies. But also a big problem with it is often a one and done thing. Somebody comes in 2 or 3 hours, does a workshop. It doesn't have long-lasting effect. There are ways, as I'll talk about in just a second, that we can reduce implicit bias. It is possible to do that, but the training that's been done so far is less effective. And certainly telling the other person that they're an idiot isn't very effective either. There's actually been studies that look at if you just confront the person and tell them they're completely wrong and how can you believe that, like we want to do many times, it just doesn't work very well. So what's more effective? Probably the number one thing we found as effective in reducing prejudice and discrimination, whether it's racial or other type, is contact with that outgroup. Getting you together with members of this group that you have this prejudice or discrimination towards. Again, more effective if it's voluntary, and much more effective if you're on equal footing when you have that contact. If the one group is in a superior position over the other, contact isn't very effective. But a lot of our stereotypes are based on misconceptions. Completely wrong information about these other groups. So when you actually get to interact with members of the other group, you start finding that you have some of these misconceptions. Some of these things you believe were wrong. Some of the reason for your negative emotion just are not legitimate. And that negative emotion can disappear and the prejudice and the discrimination can disappear. It's harder to get rid of the stereotypes themselves. But what we really want to do is diminish that negative emotion that leads to the prejudice and discrimination. And so bringing people into contact can be very helpful, particularly if that contact is collaborative of some way. One of the best things you can do is get these conflicting groups to work together on some problem, on some task. What we call a superordinate goal, a goal that's larger than either of the groups. Because if they are working together as a group, they start seeing themselves now as one group. And again, you don't want to view your own group negatively. So now I have to start thinking of these members more positively because they're part of my group. And so lots of studies and lots of real world experiences have found that when you put people together to work on a task, they not only learn about those other people more, but they start thinking about them as part of their larger group. It's somewhat similar to what happened briefly after 9/11, when we came together as Americans because there was this external threat to us. And so for a brief time, I saw other people in America as part of my group and defined myself in terms of being an American. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. Laws can be very helpful. When you force, here's a case where when you force somebody to do something, they may not like it at first, but when they get in that habit, then they realize it's not so bad and they get used to it. We all hear about the fights over wearing masks now. We got the pro-mask group, the anti-mask group, and all the reasons that you hear that people give for why they don't want to wear masks turn out to be the very same reasons people said they didn't want to wear seatbelts when those became mandatory. It restricts my freedom. I'm not allowed to do what I want, all these different things. But eventually people came to adopt the behavior. They had to adopt the behavior, and they came to see that it was valuable, and that negative emotion they had against wearing seatbelts, at least for most people, diminished and went away. So laws and some mandatory things can help. Social pressure can help. When you see that others are adopting new attitudes, new beliefs about a group, that can help as well. And finally, I'll just talk about, there's lots of other information out there, and I'll point you to another resource that has this. But there was, I didn't test this out, Judy. Let me know. I'm going to click on this link. Let me know if you can read if it takes you to a page. Are you able to see this page here, character and context?
Yeah.
No? Okay. And I will go back to it. So anyway, if you follow this link, it takes you to an article which describes a little competition that prejudice researchers had to find the best strategies to reduce prejudice and discrimination. And they tested out 17 different strategies. And the ones that were the best were the ones that made it personal for people, made it self-relevant, made it vivid, and made it emotional for people. So for example, in one study, one of the most effective methods was to have white people imagine that they were a black person being attacked by a white person, and that another black person came and helped them and prevented the attack. So it's an emotional experience. It's you personally who are experiencing it. And now you're thinking about it in terms of looking at it from the other side or the other perspective. And so we found a number of ways that, at least in these small scale studies, that we can reduce some people's implicit biases. And now we're working to try to scale those up, so we have larger strategies involved. So what many of these things say, generally I'll finish with, is treat others as you would have them treat you. They are not the other as you are not to them. We are all human beings. If we think about each other in that way, a lot of that negative emotion will disappear and much more positive behavior will follow. Thank you very much. I hope that made sense to you. I just mentioned before we get to Q&A that I have 2 links down here. The first one is to a website I have where I've got thousands of resources to videos and other things out on the web. This link is to one of the pages on it about prejudice. And so you can read a lot more and watch some really interesting videos and see some examples of all these different topics there. So that's a nice site to explore. And then the other link is one I think Barb said she will send you, it's to this page itself. So if you want to go back and click on any of these links and look at any of this material, you are welcome to do so. But let's turn that over now to your thoughts and questions.
So everyone feel free to type in your thoughts or questions on the chat. And Professor Mueller will be with us for a few more minutes to answer those questions. I have one. Professor Mueller, how does the news play a role in all of this? Or
How does what?
The news shows, the 24-hour news cycle that we're under now.
Well, that's one thing I didn't mention, that an important part of the confirmation bias. Not only do I personally in my everyday experiences look for information that agrees with me and ignore information that disagrees, but I look for sources of information that agree with me. So the websites and the news sources that I go to tend to be the ones that are going to agree with me. So I'm going to hear things that confirm my beliefs and say, see, I'm not being biased. All these other people agree with me in this case. So one thing the media has done, it's become, as you know, much more fractured. And so it's much easier now to go find and only pay attention to the things that you want to hear, the things that agree with you in those cases. And so that's a big component of the media in this process. Back in the days where many of us remember there were just 3 networks and you would go and watch one of those network news shows, just about everybody was seeing the same information. Now it's nothing like that. Even when you go on Facebook, Facebook has algorithms that feed you stuff that you want to hear. And so you think you're being exposed to everything, but you're shaped in your own little bubble and you get to hear the information that fits your beliefs in those cases.
Has this gone to an extent of to where we sort ourselves to where we live? That we find that we're moving to neighborhoods and to areas of the country of like-minded people, and it's all influenced by our prejudices and stereotypes?
Well, the fracturing of the media, as I suggested, is a fairly new phenomenon. But moving to places, like-minded places, has been around forever in the history of the United States. And we can think about white flight from the city to the suburbs and historical periods like that. Blacks moving from the South to areas in the North that were other blacks were living, now often centered in the cities in these cases. And so, yes, that is part of the equation as well. And that has always happened and continues to do so. Not surprisingly, they find that in communities where there's more diversity, you get much less prejudice, discrimination, violence, and those kinds of things. And so people are often arguing for promoting more diversity, but it's not an easy thing to do. That's something you can't force people to do, to go live where you want them to live. And so that's always going to be part of the equation too. Good question.
Another question from Denise is, do you think social distancing, separating us even more from people not like us, is likely to cause bias and racism to increase?
Intuitively, I would say yes. And so I would say the answer to that is likely yes. As a scientist, I always want to be empirical and say, it's such a new phenomenon, we don't really have much evidence yet of whether that's going to happen. This is so unique. Even of those of us who are old have never been through this before. And so I don't want to jump to a conclusion, but if you look at what other research says and extrapolate, you would think that yes, that is likely. Because again, it's much easier to maintain misconceptions about people if I don't interact with them. And so if I'm not having a chance to go and interact with you, even at work, so I don't get to go into work and be exposed to people who are different than me, that's going to make it easier for me to cling to my existing biases and even, as you suggest, the question suggests, strengthen them to some degree. Whether that's really going to happen, though, I want to hold off on. We'll have to see what the research says in that case, but that's definitely possible.
Liz asked the question, isn't there a limit to how much we try to understand someone as a human? For instance, some of the division in the political parties at this point?
Yes, yes. So that's a great question also. And what's going on in the political parties is a great example. It goes back to this symbolic threat that I talked about, a threat to our core values and beliefs. Again, 30 years ago, this is again my perception and what I've read about it, there were political parties and they fought with each other, and there was different ideologies. But the people didn't have as a core central identity for themselves a political affiliation nearly as much as they do today. I would say I'm a Democrat or Republican, but I would say, yeah, that Republican is making nonsense, or that Democrat, I disagree with what they just said. But now we're getting to the point where many people on different sides of the spectrum say everything my side says is right and everything they say or do is wrong. And I feel very threatened if people tell me that I'm wrong or that they're in a different group. And so I see more dehumanizing along political parties that I didn't see in the past. And so there's more of that fracturing, unfortunately, going on. And so there's just some individuals you can't get through to because you represent a significant threat to their values and they just don't want to hear about it.
Marianne is asking the question, excuse me while I roll down here, regarding social pressure. Do you think a national leadership change emphasizing common values and de-emphasizing disorder would help reduce bias?
That's a good loaded question. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
The easy answer is yes, it certainly would. That leadership can also shape and influence attitudes and beliefs. It's not the most powerful force. Other forces are more powerful than that. But they can play a role in it. And so when they give voice to conspiracies and prejudices that are out there and give credence to those things, it's much easier for those who want to believe it to say, see, it's justified, it's okay to do that. But it's very hard for a leader, any leader, to say, let's come together, let's all be one, let's drop our prejudices. That's a very difficult challenge, but it's going to be a much more successful path to go on if you're promoting collaboration, community, common ground among individuals. Certainly that's the case.
I think this is a question that many of us have faced in this last couple of years is, how do you, Linda asks, how do you stay friends with someone with extreme biases? Do you just ignore them?
Yes, that's a very real world and good question, challenging question in that case. I start with sort of an aside. I read an article a while back about that a social psychologist wrote about how if you go to a Cubs game or any baseball game, you've got these two people sitting next to each other who may have extremely different political views and not be aware of it. And they hug each other and high five each other when their team wins or does something good, whatever. We can get along with people that are different from us. But once we find out that they're different, and once they challenge us in the sphere where the difference is. So when we have something in common, we're both Cub fans, I can tolerate your differences a little bit. I still don't like you as much when I find that out, but I can tolerate it. But when the sphere now is a political one, where I engage you in a setting where it's the differences that really define us, it's very hard to do so. So what's more successful is find ways to engage with these individuals in more neutral contexts or in contexts where you already have something in common. You're at a, I don't even know if they have them anymore, PTA meeting. You're at a meeting with parents of your kids, and this person has a child in your school, and that's the context or other context. And again, I don't confront them and tell them they're an idiot, but some of these issues might raise. For example, the whole mask thing may come up in that school setting and context. And it's much more effective to start talking about things we have in common, you know. Start out by understanding why, some of the reasons I can understand why you wouldn't wear a mask or some of the difficulties why you have with that. But let's talk about what are the pros and cons of that. And so those two strategies, meeting them in a context where there's some commonality and acknowledging their beliefs instead of just immediately diminishing them, are ways to address some of those things. But frankly, there are just some people who don't want to hear a word you have to say. And it's just very difficult. And I just don't engage with that individual.
So what some of us are doing is okay then.
Yes, I would say it is, because there are many more people out there worth engaging in, or I wouldn't say worth engaging in, but that you can interact with. Why not pick those people to interact with? If this person is just not going to listen to you, is extreme to the point where there's no, then move on. There's other things, other people in life.
Has there been a study done that shows that when you have vastly different opinions, arguing with those people, it makes their opinions even stronger?
It can. So particularly if I present it in a way where I try to diminish them as a person, attack them in such a way that, again, it gets personal or anything like that, there definitely can be a backlash. And so you can actually strengthen their beliefs when you think you're trying to diminish them by attacking them in certain kinds of ways, as opposed to what I was just describing. Definitely, it can backlash and work against what you're trying to do in that case. Just think again, put yourself in their shoes. You don't want to hear them ridiculing your beliefs, ridiculing you as a person. Imagine the things that would most offend you and most create resistance in you. Avoid doing those things to the other person.
Miriam asks a question. You mentioned that learning about other people who are different from me, for example, people of color, would be to being part of different groups, talk with them. Yet when it comes to systemic racism that is so prevalent right now, yes, people of color are saying they can't teach us. We white people have to learn about the racism issues from each other. Sometimes I feel like it's the blind leading the blind.
That's a very good question. And I hear that. People of color will sometimes say that, but many other people of color will say, no, come talk to me. Ask me stupid questions or questions you think are dumb. Let's have a dialogue. And so the general answer to that question is, if you encounter that, again, go find another person of color. You'll find people who are willing to talk with you, who appreciate the fact that you're trying to reach out and learn and find out about them in this case. Find forums where that's more possible and people are receptive to that. So it's hard to find out about other groups of people, particularly ones that you don't know much about just by reading on the internet or trying to figure it out for yourself. There's lots of good information out there. You can explore that. But it's best to go engage yourself with different groups of people. I know on the religious side of things, people will go to religious services of groups to go to a Buddhist group, go to a Muslim mosque, go to different things just to find out what their services are like, their experiences are like. And often, particularly in those settings, you'll find the people quite welcoming and willing to engage you in those processes.
Well, Professor Mueller, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed, and I can tell by the comments here, others are saying that it's been a fantastic hour that you've spent with us, and we've learned a lot.
Well, great. I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed it myself. And when I give one of these talks, I always give a little bonus, and that is you can send out, when you send out follow-up, you can send out my email address. And if anyone wants to continue the conversation or ask further questions of me, I'm welcome to engage in that, even if you're different from me.
And how do we enroll in your class? That's what I'm.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's closed. It's hit the max.
I can see why. I can see why.
But when I hold class in person, and hopefully that happens someday, I'm always welcome to visitors to come into that class. Social psychology, that's a great one to come. It's really a lot of fun, and you're welcome anytime.
You will
Just
see
not
my
this
face
semester.
again then. So thank you again, Judy.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Mueller, for making us more aware. We really appreciate your sharing this fascinating information. Please remember, this program was recorded and it will be posted on our league's website. And please join us next month for Carolyn Lukensmeyer, and she will be talking about building trust, and that will be on Thursday, September 17th. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks to everybody for attending.
Yes, thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Two.